Singapore Airlines Flight 319 was heading from London to Singapore. There were over 270 passengers on board. Everything seemed normal. But as they got close to Changi Airport, the weather turned brutal. Heavy rain, hurricane-like strong winds, and thick clouds made it impossible to see the runway. The tension in the cockpit kept rising. After several go-arounds, the plane was running low on fuel, and every passing second was pushing it closer to danger. Now, the lives of hundreds of people on that plane depended on this. Let's see what the pilot decides in the next few minutes. Will the plane land safely, or will this flight turn into another tragic accident? Let's find out. This is the heart-stopping story of Singapore Airlines Flight 319. On the evening of October 25, 2022, the Singapore Airlines flight crew gathered at London's Heathrow Airport. Their mission, a nearly 13-hour non-stop flight to Singapore's Changi Airport. The timing was perfect since there's an 8-hour difference between the UK and Singapore, meaning they could fly in the morning and comfortably arrive home by afternoon. After the flight, it was the perfect time for the crew to relax. When they reached the airport, the pilots were given a flight briefing. It covered the weather, route, important notices, and technical details. The weather along the flight route was normal, but there was a chance of storms during landing in Singapore. However, the report said the storms would be brief and runway visibility would be okay. So, the pilots didn't worry too much about the landing. Still, they picked 3 alternate airports just in case of an emergency: Paya Lebar, Kuala Lumpur, and Senai. Though there was also a chance of storms at those places, but these runways were fine as backups too. When an alternate airport is chosen, the aim is usually that its weather is better than the main airport. But conditions like storms can change really fast. So pilots have to stay extra alert. Now, talking about fuel, according to the flight plan, the plane was loaded with 106,100 kilos of fuel, which included contingency fuel. That's the extra fuel meant for emergencies. Usually, in European airspace, there are shortcuts that save fuel. That's why the pilots thought they didn't need any more fuel. After all the preparations, the pilots briefed Kevin's crew, and then everyone head towards their planes. The captain of this flight was 55 years old and had over 13,400 hours of flying experience. He used to fly the Boeing 747 and had gradually logged more than 10,000 hours on the Boeing 777, making him extremely reliable both technically and in terms of experience. Alongside him on this mission was the 31-year-old first officer, who also had over 2,200 hours of experience flying the Boeing 777. They both agreed that for this flight, the first officer would be flying the plane while the captain kept an eye on things. The aircraft they were flying was a Boeing 7300ER, a powerful long-range plane powered by GE9015B turbofan engines. Before takeoff, the captain did an external inspection of the plane, while the first officer set up all the systems inside. Meanwhile, 280 passengers had already boarded. Everything was going according to plan, and at 8:06 p.m., the plane took off from Heathrow Airport. The climb and cruise phases of the flight went completely smoothly. When they left Europe, they found some route shortcuts that put the plane in a position to reach Singapore 30 minutes early, with a good amount of fuel still left. As soon as they entered Kuala Lumpur's control zone, they were informed that the landing would be on runway 20 using an ILS approach. The first officer started preparing for landing, and the captain went over the entire procedure once again. At that time, they had about 7 tons of fuel, while the final reserve fuel should only be 3 tons. So, from a safety standpoint, everything looked good. Here's an important thing to know. Final reserve fuel is a kind of, there's emergency backup fuel. It's only used in really critical situations. That means there should be extra fuel left during landing. When a pilot sets off on a long flight, the first thing they do is make sure the plane has all the necessary types of fuel. First up is taxi fuel. That's the fuel used to get the plane moving on the ground. Next is trip fuel, which is needed for the entire flight and a safe landing at the destination. Now, imagine if the weather on the way, if things go wrong or there's heavy traffic, that's when contingency fuel comes into play, which can be about 3 to 5% of the trip fuel. If the pilot expects bad weather beforehand, they can also load extra fuel. But let's say the plane reaches its destination and suddenly can't land. Maybe a storm hits or the runway is blocked. In that case, the plane has to divert to a nearby alternate airport. That's where alternate fuel comes in so the plane can fly there and land safely. And now comes the most important part, is the final reserve fuel. It's like an emergency backup that's not touched under normal circumstances. Its purpose is to make sure that even if everything else goes wrong, the plane can still stay in the air for at least 30 minutes, giving the pilots time to make their final decision. All these parts together make up the legal minimum fuel, which is the minimum amount of fuel every commercial flight must have. If an airline flies with just the minimum fuel, it doesn't mean they're taking a risk. In fact, carrying more fuel than needed actually causes losses. Just like a plane gets heavier, it burns more fuel and affects the environment too. Now, let's understand what happens if something goes wrong when the plane is about to land and how the pilot and air traffic control handle the situation. In such cases, the plane is often put into a holding pattern, a circular path, kind of like a racetrack. Here the plane flies in circles at a certain altitude until it gets clearance to land. If for some reason the pilot has to wait by flying in circles, that's called holding. They set this up in their computer. The computer already knows how much fuel is left and tells us how long we can stay in the holding pattern. After that, the pilot asks ATC, how long until landing? If the answer is that the runway will be clear shortly and the weather is good, the pilot decides to stay in the holding pattern and starts using alternate fuel. But if the delay seems longer or conditions are uncertain, the pilots start preparing to divert to another airport so they don't end up using the final reserve fuel. Now, let's say we're in the holding pattern and alternate fuel is being used, and then ATC says they'll have to stay in the air for 5 more minutes, so the pilot immediately checks the fuel. If the fuel is close to the limit, they quickly decide to divert and inform ATC to avoid any last-minute issues. If the pilot sees on the flight management computer that with just a little more delay, they'll have only one chance left to land, and any further delay means using the final reserve fuel, they alert ATC by declaring minimum. This call isn't an emergency, it's just to keep ATC informed. It's meant as a warning that there isn't much time left, but it doesn't really give them any special priority. If there's still a delay after this and the pilots feel that the fuel will drop below the final reserve by the time they land, they immediately declare Mayday, 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 low fuel. This is an emergency call, and after that, the flight is given top priority to land, no matter if it means opening a military runway. But keep in mind, all this happens according to the rules. It doesn't mean the pilot or the airline made a mistake. Is this plane in danger? Now, the real twist came when the flight was near Singapore and descending below 15,000 feet. At 8:05 in the morning, ATC called and said the plane would have to enter a holding pattern at a point called PSPU. The reason was that the runway 20 ride where they were supposed to land had a strong tailwind, meaning wind blowing from behind. It's actually safer to land into a headwind, which is wind coming from the front. If the tailwind goes over 10 knots, they immediately close that runway and have to switch to another one. Just then, the plane, as they got closer to Singapore, the weather started to turn bad. The captain checked the weather radar and saw heavy rain and storm clouds over the airport and surrounding areas. This bad weather wasn't just limited to Singapore. Nearby airports like Paya, Lebar, and Senai were also affected. So if they had to divert, there weren't many options. The only real choice was Kuala Lumpur, but that was pretty far. Then the captain noticed another airport just south of Singapore, Batam, where the weather was clear and the distance was shorter. If they made that their new backup airport, if they had taken off, they would have had a bit more time and maybe even gotten a chance to land in Singapore. The flight made a loop near the passport holding point. That's when ATC told them the runway had been changed. Now they had to land on runway 02 left. A few seconds later, the first officer handed control over to the captain so he could plan for the new runway, and the flight was connected to the arrival controller, who started guiding them for the new runway. But by then, the weather down below had gotten even worse. Heavy rain and strong winds. The wind kept changing direction, and the storm was making conditions on the runway worse and worse. Things got so bad that 2 other flights had to abort their landings and take off again, and at the same time, Flight 319 was slowly approaching the runway. Due to heavy rain on the runway, visibility was down to just 500 meters. The situation got so bad that ATC stopped all landings until the weather improved. Flight 319 was supposed to have landed by then, but it was still in the air, and its fuel reserve had dropped close to the 7-ton limit. The Boeing 7 was burning about 100 to 130 per minute. The plane burns a kilo of fuel. If the landing had to be canceled, the consumption would go up even more. At 4:29, ATC told the flight that the landing would be delayed by at least 5 more minutes. That meant they'd have to stay in the air until 4:34. By then, they'd have about 5,900 kilos of fuel left, which was okay but not a lot. Meanwhile, the captain checked the weather at Batam Airport. The weather there was good and landing was possible. But then they found out that the heavy storm over Singapore was slowly moving toward Batam. The captain alerted ATC that they only have enough fuel left for 1 more holding pattern. After that, they'll have to divert to Batam. They made it clear that after this, they'll be in an emergency fuel situation. The ATC could clearly see the captain's intention now. If they don't get immediate landing clearance, the flight will have to head to Batam. ATC quickly started coordinating with Tanjung Pinang ATC and Batam Airport to see if they could handle the flight. But up in the sky, the pilots still hadn't received any confirmation, and down below, two of their big engines were low on fuel. They were eating. The fuel was running out fast every second. But as the plane moved toward the bottom, heavy rain and strong winds started. The flight crew didn't expect this. Now the situation got even tenser. The captain, who had been monitoring until now, took control himself. Maybe it was company policy that the captain should fly in case of diversion, or maybe things got so bad that he had to take the controls. Usually, in times like these, the captain monitors so they can keep an eye on ATC, weather, and other communications. But now he handed over to the first officer. Someone said that he should set the viewer approach and pull out the necessary charts. One of these charts was a company document that clearly stated that bottom autoland is only allowed on the ILS approach, not on the viewer. But maybe the captain forgot this. Interestingly, just 1 minute after the diversion started, the crew asked ATC if they were allowing a landing back in Singapore. So there was still hope that they might get a chance to return. At 4:46 p.m., ATC said that landing clearance for the bottom hadn't been granted yet, but they'll keep giving radar vectors. Right now, the plane only had 4,500 kilos of fuel left. The first officer immediately declared minimum fuel on the radio. That meant if there was even a slight delay now, they'd have to start using their last 30 minutes of reserve fuel. It's important to note that declaring minimum fuel doesn't directly affect ATC's decisions. They still operate by the usual rules. But just 2 minutes later, the captain took the radio and clearly said, "Mayday, Mayday, Singapore Airlines 310. We're out of fuel." This had become an emergency. So there was no time for long, drawn-out coordination anymore. The pilot was immediately cleared to land at Batam Airport. At 4:55 p.m., the controller clearly stated that they were being given priority on approach. That means they'd be the first to land. This was a serious alert, and it worked. The pilots knew that by the time they touched down, they'd have less than 3,000 kilos of fuel left. Any more delay could be dangerous. ATC immediately had them contact the next control center. They were told to do it. Then at 4:55 p.m., they got clearance for a visual approach to runway 2, and it was made clear that the flight was now being given priority. The captain was flying the plane himself and talking to ATC, while the first officer was setting up essential systems and helping with the approach chart. Around 5 p.m., as the plane began descending on the visual approach, getting close to the runway, air traffic control informed them that there was a strong tailwind blowing towards runway 2, reaching speeds of 30 knots or about 55 kilometers. Meanwhile, the Boeing 777s, the limit is only 15 knots, which is about 27 kilometers or hour, and according to Singapore Airlines rules, landing is only allowed with a tailwind of up to 10 knots. So, it was clear that if the plane landed on runway 22, it would have been against the rules and risky. In this situation, the crew made a smart decision and aborted the landing at 1,600 feet. Then they climbed back up to 1,800 feet and tried landing again using the ILS approach from the opposite direction. The weather was bad at that time too. There were clouds all around, and visibility was decreasing. Things were getting serious. The plane was running out of fuel really fast. Then the low fuel warning came on, which meant there was very little fuel left. The pilots had to immediately start some crucial safety procedures called the QRH checklist. According to that, they could only set the flaps to 20 degrees to keep the fuel flowing to the engine and prevent it from shutting down. Flaps at 20 degrees meant the plane had to land at a slightly higher speed and would need a longer runway to stop. Luckily, Batam Airport's runway was long enough, so it was all good. Nothing major to worry about. When the plane was just 11 kilometers away from the runway, the captain started turning it to the left. Maybe he was trying to avoid bad weather or save some fuel. He took a shortcut to get to the runway faster. At the same time, he switched on the autoland system, which helps land the plane automatically. But this system only works properly if the plane is at least 600 feet high and right above the ILS track. Usually, planes are lower than that when approaching the runway. They should have caught the ILS at least 5 nautical miles out so they could land straight and smoothly. But Flight 31 only tried to pick up the ILS about 2 nautical miles before. And even then, the plane was descending really fast at 1,300 feet per minute with a bank angle over 15 degrees, which is pretty risky at that stage. Around 5:05, the first officer said they could see the runway, but the rain was still pouring heavily. The plane was about 1,200 feet up, and the captain was now trying to manually line up the plane with the runway. Meanwhile, ATC contacted them from the bottom tower. They tried to make contact, but the crew never managed to connect with the tower. Maybe there was a problem with the radio signal, or maybe there was so much going on inside the plane that the crew just didn't pay attention. This basically means that the last and most important communication before landing Getting permission to touch down on the runway never fully happened. Things got even more serious here. As soon as the captain switched the autopilot back on for automatic landing, a no auto land warning popped up on the screen. The system was showing that the plane was way to the left of the runway line and flying higher than it should have been. The captain got a bit confused. This happened because he tried to catch the ILS system by getting too close to the runway. At that time, the plane was also at a very high pitch, so the autopilot didn't have enough time to adjust properly. Meanwhile, the air traffic control tower didn't get any radio call from the plane, nor was landing clearance requested. On top of that, the rain was so heavy that the runway wasn't clearly visible. Visibility had dropped to just 500 meters. At this point, the plane was only 132 feet above the ground, so they were really close to landing. But right then, the captain decided to abort the landing and go around. That means they chose to take off again. To do that, he pressed the throttle button, which brought both engines to full power, and the plane started climbing again. But now, there was another big problem: fuel. You see, a big plane like the Boeing 7 uses about 500 kilos of fuel just to take off again. The first go-around was done from a bit higher up, so they saved some fuel. But this time, the go-around happened right near the runway. They ended up using more fuel than expected. Now, the plane had barely 2,000 kilos or maybe even less fuel left, and that was the biggest worry. It was around 5:09 p.m., but they should have landed 46 minutes ago. So, things were pretty critical and way past the planned time. The captain asked ATC about runway 2, but it took 90 seconds to get a reply. Meanwhile, the plane made a big turn, went downwind, and tried to get back in line for landing. ATC then said runway 04 was available. Visibility was only 500 meters, while on runway 2 it was 6 kilometers. The wind wasn't strong, though. The captain decided there wasn't enough fuel left to reach runway 2. So, despite the low visibility, they had to land on runway 04. This time, the plane was at 3,000 feet, speed 220 knots, and the runway was just 10 kilometers away. Everything had to be done super fast, right on time, and without any mistakes. On the third landing attempt, as soon as the plane came out of the clouds, it was way above the runway. So the captain immediately tried to bring the plane down. But the downdraft was really strong, around 1,400 feet per minute. They got a sink rate warning and had to go around for the third time. With only 212 feet altitude left, the fuel was almost gone. The plane climbed and leveled off at 2,000 feet. The captain said they'd be landing on runway 22 with a visual teardrop approach. By now, there was probably less than 1,000 kilos of fuel left. ATC informed them the wind was coming from behind, but the captain took the risk. Luckily, the weather had cleared up, and at 5:19, Flight 39 landed safely. But the flight was below the danger limit. The investigation revealed the accident happened because of the weather and the captain's stubborn decisions. Now, this case is part of Singapore Airlines training so that better decisions can be made in similar situations in the future. The lesson here is that when things go bad, you shouldn't rush. Instead, stay calm and think carefully before making a decision. So that's the end of the flight story, friends. But now, there's another story, one that's connected to my own life. Hello friends, my name is Shubham Patel, and today, for the first time, I'm revealing my face to all of you. When I started this Crossyear channel, I didn't know that you all have shown so much love and support to this channel. And today, we've finally become a family of 100,000 subscribers. You probably have no idea how much hard work goes into making these kinds of videos. Like, it took me a whole 27 days just to make this documentary. From researching to scripting, from visuals to editing, every single frame involves day and night effort. And I do all this just for you, so you can get high-quality videos. And the real reward for all my hard work is your love and support me. If you like my videos, please make sure to like and subscribe because that's what gives me the energy to create even better content.